Stress is something that we all feel. Now, we all feel it to different degrees and at different times. And we can all understand what stress means when we think of it in a felt sense. But what is stress actually all about? What causes stress? And how can you overcome stress? Now, like anything, in order for us to overcome something, we have to understand what it's really all about. So what exactly is stress? Well, the first thing I would say about what stress is that it's a perfectly normal reaction to something either positive or negative, and that can come in things like physical reactions, emotional reactions, or mental reactions. Now, like I said, these responses don't necessarily have to be negative. One of the things in society is that we assume that in order for us to feel stressed out, something negative has to happen. You know, being overloaded at work, having a uni assignment deadline impending, and we've not done enough work. Those are the kind of things that are negative that would stress us out. But there are also plenty of positive things in our lives that can stress us out too. You know, about to have a child, or winning the lottery even. Things like that, having a pay increase at work, being promoted at work. These are the kind of things that are quite positive, but they can still induce a high degree of stress. Now, what I said at the very start as well is that we all experience stress, and in truth, we all have to experience stress. Stress, or a small amount of stress experienced over a short amount of time, can actually be really beneficial. If you think about conducting a wedding speech or building adrenaline before a race, you're going to need a little bit of stress in order to get you in the zone, to get you focused for the task at hand. So one of the things that's really important to understand here is that when we're trying to conquer stress, it's going to be impossible, and it's also not functional if we completely get rid of stress altogether in our lives. To some degree, so long as it's short-lived and so long as it's a small amount, we do need stress to an extent. When stress becomes long-term, or what we call chronic, or to situations that don't require stress, that's when things can become an issue. So people, for example, can become stressed out about getting on a bus. I know I'm just using different random analogies here, but getting on a bus. Some people can even be stressed out from just leaving their home. These are kind of situations that don't warrant stress. And when those kind of situations start to stress us out, or when things become longer term or they become chronic, that's when stress can become a real issue. And that's when we need to start thinking about how do we actually overcome that level of stress. And this brings us on nicely to our next point. How do we actually start overcoming that level of stress? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to recognize the difference between good and bad stress. Now, that's exactly what we were talking about a minute ago. You know, we need stress to some degree. We also need to be careful of stress when it can become too much. And this reminds me often of when I work with my anxious clients who come to therapy for anxiety. One of the things that happens with clients with anxiety is they come to therapy and they say, in one way or another, I want to get rid of anxiety. I no longer want to feel anxious at all. First of all, that's impossible. We're all going to feel anxious to some degree. Second of all, it's not practical or functional. We need anxiety. If you and I were to all of a sudden hear gunshots outside, we should start feeling pretty anxious about that. That's appropriate. It gets us ready for action. It maybe gets us more focused. We can start to think of things that are appropriate for us to do next. If we didn't have anxiety, then we just wouldn't care about those gunshots happening outside. That would be ridiculous, and it wouldn't be very safe. The same goes for stress. We need to recognize that there is good stress, we need to recognize that there is bad stress, and we need to identify what that means for us subjectively. Chronic stress is basically induced when we utilize stress principles to situations that don't warrant it. What can happen often with anxiety is that people think that they need anxiety in order to function. And that can be one of the real challenges. And I know I'm overlaying stress and anxiety here a little bit, but I'm just using it as an analogy. What can happen with clients with anxiety is that they can get anxious about no longer feeling anxious, if that makes sense. They've come so far in their lives utilizing these anxious principles. It's got them through so far. It might not be very pleasant, but at the end of the day, it's getting them through. It's making them survive. It's helping them survive. The same situation can be applied to stress. Sometimes what happens is people think that they need stress in order to function just in everyday life. So they apply those stress principles to things like getting on the bus or leaving the house. That's when things become chronic. So when I'm talking about recognizing good and bad stress for yourself subjectively, that's why this is so important. One of my biggest philosophies in therapy and mental health is that one of the biggest interventions that we can have is a truer understanding of the problem that we face. And that goes especially for things like stress and anxiety as well. We need to understand the subjectivity of this issue. You need to understand what your stress is all about, the times that you feel chronic stress, and the times when actually you say, you know what, I need stress for that big board meeting, or I need stress for that wedding speech, or to run that race. That's okay, so long as it's short-lived. The second point that we need to understand or utilize when we're trying to conquer our stress is to understand when stress is becoming limiting for you. Now, you can understand that a little bit when you look at times when you need stress and the times where chronic stress is appropriate or happening in your life. You need to recognize the times when stress is becoming a bit of an issue. Like I said, you can start exhibiting elements of chronic stress when you simply just think you need stress in order to function. If there are situations where you can stand back and say, well, hold on, do I need to be stressed out about this? Logically, no. That means we need to address that. And this is obviously very, very subjective and difficult to address when I'm doing a video to the masses, but kind of engaging with this subjectively, recognizing when stress is not appropriate in your life is one of the biggest steps in actually overcoming that stress. One of the other biggest things that we can do in order to help with our stress is to build stronger connections with other people. One of the things that happens often with stress is that it's very kind of individualized, it's reserved, we keep it to ourselves, and it's a coping mechanism for us to get through on our own. In order for us to overcome chronic stress and when stress becomes an issue, we need to start being able to build stronger and more robust relationships with those around us. We need to establish more of a support mechanism. Now, often this is where therapy can come in. Therapy and that therapeutic relationship can be a really beneficial mediator and intervention when it comes to chronic stress, but you can also get those relationships from elsewhere in your life. Friends, work colleagues, family. If you are able to invest in those relationships and focus in on developing them, that's going to be a really helpful process in you overcoming your stress. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to talk about your stress with those people in those relationships. That might be appropriate and it might be very helpful, but actually simply just developing a positive relationship with other people is one of the most beneficial things that you can do. Things with stress, and I am overlapping anxiety with this a little bit. One of the things that can happen is that we can start to isolate ourselves. When we experience chronic stress, we kind of, like I said, we keep it to ourselves, we individualize it. It detaches us at times from other people. Re-establishing those connections, building those relationships can be one of the most beneficial things that we can do when we're thinking about overcoming stress. Now, my next point might sound really, really basic, but in my opinion, it can be one of the most powerful interventions that we can utilize when overcoming any kind of difficulty, including things like stress. That is our eating patterns and our sleeping patterns. Now, I had a conversation with a therapist a number of weeks ago who said that a majority, kind of 50% of the clients that they see for anxiety and depression, see marked improvements when they change their eating habits and they implement a sleeping pattern and a sleeping routine. Now, I think that that's quite a high number to say that half of those clients see improvements because of that, but I can understand it. I can see how eating patterns and irregular sleep patterns can make us depressed, can make us anxious, and can stress us out. If you can implement an appropriate sleeping pattern, and by that what I mean is going to bed at the same time each day and waking up at the same time, trying to get a solid amount of sleep. I'm not going to tell you you need your 8 hours or your 7 hours or your 6 hours, because some people are just different, but it's the timing of those sleep patterns. If you're able to get to sleep at the same time each day, wake up the same time, that's you implementing an appropriate sleep pattern. The same goes for eating. If you're able to eat around similar times throughout the day, that's not always possible, of course, and focusing in on nutrition, these kind of things can have a really, really positive impact on our stress levels, and they're the kind of things that you can utilize and impact in the immediate moment. You can do that right now. You can start putting in changes yourself. And I think this is a really powerful intervention that we need to understand a little bit more about. So if you're feeling chronic stress, if you want to overcome elements of your stress, think about your sleeping pattern, implement a bit of a routine, think about your eating habits and your patterns, implement a bit of a routine on that, and hopefully that'll help. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is very, very, very subjective, and it's about learning a down-regulating process or a down-regulating technique. Now, when I say it's very subjective, again, these things are very different for different people. You may have heard of mindfulness or breathing exercises. These things can be very helpful, but they're also very subjective. What works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. What is true and what is objective is that processes of down-regulating, whatever they look like, can be really helpful for an individual experiencing stress. What can happen with stress is that our levels in the chemicals in our brains, which we've actually not gone into in this video, but maybe we could go into that at another point, thinking about the biology behind stress. What can happen is those things are so heightened, and it's throughout the day they can just be heightened, and even when they're not needed, even when those chemicals and hormones are not needed, they're still at very high levels. What we need to do is be able to down-regulate ourselves. Now, we're constantly stimulated in society throughout the day, through screens, through conversations, even things like road traffic. We're constantly stimulated. If we go home and we keep stimulating ourselves, or we keep utilizing stress for different for reasons that we don't need it, then that stress is just not going to go anywhere. If you can implement things like a breathing technique, things that you enjoy, maybe reading a book, listening to music, going for a walk, these kind of techniques that can down-regulate you when you get the opportunity can be so valuable to tell your body and your brain that actually we don't need to be stressed out right now. It's okay, we can down-regulate. Again, I'm not going to necessarily impose techniques upon you. Those things are subjective. I encourage you to do a little bit of research and find out for yourself, but down-regulating techniques can be super powerful. Okay guys, thanks so much for watching this week's episode of GetPsyched. This week we've been taking a look at conquering your stress. We've had a look at what stress is, the ways in which stress can relate to us, how we can feel more stressed about things, and ultimately how we can start overcoming that stress. If you've enjoyed today's video guys, then make sure to like, you can comment and share as well. And if you have enjoyed today's video, you're definitely going to enjoy this video on the psychology of relationships, so make sure to click it and check it out. Also guys, if you've been enjoying GetPsyched as a whole, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. You can hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and you'll get weekly reminders every time I upload. Thanks so much for watching guys, and hopefully catch you next week.